Some of the things we've been discussing on the Newscast podcast this week. After months and months of speculation, Rachel Reeves finally delivered her budget with a message for the country.
That does mean that today I am asking everyone to make a contribution.
So, whose shoulders is this actually going to fall on? The head of the think tank, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, gave her verdict on the podcast.
Basically, everyone's paying more, right across the income distribution, but the rich are paying proportionately more.
Oh, it's not on the
6, 7. Yeah.
And after Keir Starmer apologises for leading a primary school class in the viral 6-7 dance from TikTok, Chris Mason gave us his version.
The children will go 6, 7, 6, 7 and do a little dance with their hands moving up and down.
And if you want to subscribe to our daily podcast, just scan the QR code, which is on your screen now, and which will make regular appearances during this episode of Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.
Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio.
And it's Chris in the studio.
And it's Alex in the studio.
And it's Faisal in the studio.
Just a few little behind-the-scenes things to deal with, first of all. So, Faisal and Chris, I call you Statler and Waldorf, like the grumpy Muppets. They're both grumpy and old. Neither of which is the problem.
Just below
and you were on Politics Live when the accidental transmission of the budget in advance happened via the OBR. What was it like when you were sat in the studio and basically the whole thing came out in advance?
I'd got some WhatsApps from some very enterprising colleagues who had access to the financial wires. So this is Reuters, essentially. Reuters. It was like Reuters : OBR says this. And I couldn't actually believe it. And I slightly lost what was going on around me. I was like, this can't be right. And you're like, oh. And I was just tapping away, and you can probably see it. But yeah, they were proven right. And then we just had to decide in real time to kind of go with it and go for it.
And the extraordinary thing was, by the way, just picking up on that point, I was talking to somebody in the Treasury today who said that they'd taken a call. This was about 11:45 yesterday morning.
So 45 minutes before
exactly, which was from Reuters, which was described as a courtesy call to say just to let you know,
Right.
It's out there in the wild, and we're reporting on it. Upon which the senior civil servants were told, and by this stage the Chancellor was already in the Commons for the Prime Minister's questions.
This is wild.
Even as I'm reading that out, the sheer absurdity of reading out something that the Chancellor has not yet announced in the House of Commons is mind-blowing. And so there was Faisal and I and Vicky, and we're looking at this document, and I was literally going Control F for fine. Well, what should we look up and read out? Salary sacrifice. Oh, yeah, there it is.
Income tax thresholds. Yeah.
There it is. And then just reading it out on the telly, effectively announcing the... But at one point, Faisal was in this riff, and I just couldn't help but say at the end of it, you've just missed out saying, and I commend this statement to the House, which is how ministers will end an address,
Although it turns out that it wasn't a link that was put up erroneously by the OBR. It sounds like you could actually, if you just typed something into the URL, you could get to it. And they're now saying today that it was maybe an external person.
Yeah.
And they're going to have this review that maybe will report back by next week.
Yeah, some sort of swift review and investigation into what happened. And there was this idea that it might have been something external. I think that phrase was used by the chair of the OBR, but I don't think we really know how it happened, apart from the fact they were mortified by the fact it did.
I did try and explain this very badly on Politics Live at the time, which is that they surfaced the link, they pre-prepare it, but it isn't, you can't get to it, or you shouldn't be able to get to it unless you're very smart about guessing what the URL might be. That's what we think has happened. We're not entirely sure. It was a total disaster, and I couldn't resist the chance to actually give a budget, which is what we did.
I've just had a brainwave. We should do just one day when we've got quite a boring episode of Newscast, just like hide it somewhere on the internet and get people to find it and create loads of buzz around it, and then people will listen to it.
Where is Newscast?
Yeah, where is Newscast? Where is it? What's the URL?
Where would you hide it?
On the OBR website. Here's the place. All the cool kids are searching 24/7. Anyway, once the budget was actually then delivered, which was a Wednesday lunchtime, people have had plenty of time to digest it. We've had the reaction from the Institute for Fiscal Studies, the Resolution Foundation think tank, all the charities, all the stakeholders, and then the Prime Minister and the Chancellor themselves out kind of selling it again to the public today, and you, Chris.
Yeah, so they were in Warwickshire, they're in Rugby, and they were at a community centre and doing the thing that Prime Ministers and Chancellors kind of always do the day after the budget, which is go out. They usually get out of London. Chancellor will do their morning round of interviews on a factory floor somewhere or whatever, and the Chancellor did just that. Then we turned up in this community centre and they were sort of working the tables. It seemed like a fairly sympathetic audience. to Labour's message. And then the Prime Minister had a chat with a handful of us journalists. And the thing I was struck by really is that this is a leftwards tilt. There's sort of, they are leaning in and proudly sort of owning that this is a tax and spend budget where they have chosen to put up a load of taxes and they're choosing to go big on various spending plans and then lean into what they think is the case for that. And that is a distinctly different flavour of them articulating what they're about than they were doing, say, in the election campaign or in even some of the time since.
And let's hear how the Prime Minister did that in that conversation with you.
You frequently used to say country first, party second. Isn't the reality of this budget that it's party first, country second, that you've got to keep your own MPs on side because they're deeply nervous about how unpopular the government is, how unpopular you are?
Absolutely not. You and I have done I don't know how many interviews, both before the election and after the election. I have repeatedly said that I want my government to drive down child poverty. That is a political mission, it is a personal mission. I don't want hundreds of thousands of children in this country living in poverty. I think it's abhorrent. And I'm really proud that yesterday was the day that this government lifted 500,000, 500,000 children out of poverty. It's a very good thing for those children. It's very good. Very good in relation to their life chances, because this affects them for the rest of their life.
And of course, Alex, that was the Prime Minister talking about lifting the two-child benefit cap. Now, he's obviously always been in favour of lifting children out of poverty, but he's not always been in favour of doing that by abandoning the two-child benefit cap.
Well, he's been under a lot of pressure from his MPs in his own party to do that for some time, and he's been resisting it up until this point because, of course, they've been in power since July last year. And the argument they've always made is that we do want to do this. It's a central mission of this government to bring down child poverty. The last Labour government did it, but we can only do it when it's affordable. Now, of course, what they're suggesting is they've now decided it's affordable, but of course they've chosen to be able to afford it by the other measures in the budget, notably putting up taxes. And it did come after a long period where Labour MPs have been saying this is what we want, which is why you lead to that question that Chris was putting to him. Is this about, you sort of responding to your own party and the demands that there have been within it? Because we know how much pressure the Chancellor and the Prime Minister have been under from Labour MPs who, quite frankly, some of them have been pretty unhappy about the direction of things recently. So, yeah, I don't think any politician would say they don't want child poverty to improve. But the fact they've taken this measure at this time has led to that round of questioning. And of course, it's worth remembering that early on in this government, there are a number of Labour MPs who lost the whip. So basically were booted out of the Parliamentary Labour Party for a while because they had supported the SNP calling for that cap to be lifted. So, there's been an evolution to reach to this point where the government is actually implementing this policy.
And there's arguments around all of this, around the best mechanisms for helping children out of poverty. And there's plenty who say that if you're going to do a single thing as a government and you conclude that you can afford it, that doing this is a good way of doing that. But there is an argument, and we've heard it from the Conservatives and others, that makes a case around fairness. George Osborne made the argument way back when the Conservatives were in power as Chancellor around the fairness of having a limit, because the argument goes that if families who are not on benefits have to make decisions about budgeting, then why shouldn't others? And then the reason I thought I wanted to put that question in the way I did to the Prime Minister is that there is opinion poll evidence that absolutely points to the fact that the cap, soon to go, is popular and more popular than doing what the government has decided to do. But it is also true, as Alex was saying, that getting rid of the cap is very popular, not universally, but very popular amongst Labour MPs, was a big strand of the conversation during the recent deputy leadership race, etc., etc. So there is a difference there between the instinct of many Labour MPs and the instinct of plenty of people in the country.
And Faisal, my laptop just buzzed, which is a bit like you being on the 10 o'clock news last night and your family members phoning you on your smartwatch and you apparently answering by the looks of things what I was watching. But Faisal, back to that point Chris was making about, this is a government tilting leftwards and maybe dialing down the rhetoric about, we're going to go for economic growth, we're going to change the planning system, we're going to become an innovation nation. And actually, I'm just thinking back to that paragraph in the OBR document that says, we haven't scored, in their language, any measures that the government's brought forward to boost economic growth because none of them are that big a deal for us to even count them. What is going on here?
So I don't think I've got a slightly different view or a slightly different sort of lens on all this. I see this as a sort of stop the chaos budget. We've had extraordinary chaos, both and the political and the sort of market chaos have been intertwined. And so you can see this leftward tilt. Not that the markets are desperate to kind of increase the welfare bill, they're not. But what markets really don't like, and what I ultimately think, for example, did for Liz Truss, they don't like governments that can't pass their budgets, which is a ridiculous thing to say about a government. I forget what was the majority currently. It's like 150 something. Yeah. But it's not what it was during the election, whatever it is. But there were questions. We had this debate, didn't we, on Newscast last week about, is it really, could they maybe struggle to pass a budget? And I think that's probably been the point of this measure of the leftward tilt, as you might call it, is to get the whole Labour Party behind them and to put that stuff to bed. That also happens to help with the markets, actually. And then also being strict at the end of the Parliament on borrowing with the tax rises. And that's obviously a really important part of this, which is the timing. The spending comes up front. The taxes come in 3 years. We'll go on to discuss about what that means for maybe how likely that is to actually happen. And so you have this, you shore up your political base, you can pass your budgets, and you've got more command of Parliament than you had. Then at the end, you say we double the headroom, so we double the room for manoeuvre on our borrowing to 22 billion. You stop trying to test this every 6 months. That has caused, frankly, a total hamster wheel roller coaster of chaos.
Yeah, because one of the other things that Rachel Reeves announced on Wednesday was that the OBR won't do a full set of judging whether she's going to hit her fiscal rules in the spring. Yeah. They'll only do it once a year in the autumn.
And you think back to the past year, when you have a government with a massive majority that just hasn't seemed like it, and every time you're reporting on, both of you guys are reporting on the ructions in the Labour backbenches looks insecure. I'm reporting every single ONS number, but it's every random number, but like inflation or employment or GDP or public finances,
and it always matters.
Well, it always matters because there's this doom loop of like bad number. Oh no, the government's going to have to respond in 2 or 3 months' time. That means more taxes. It's depressing for everybody. People don't feel the animal spirits in the economy, don't invest, don't want to spend. So you get more bad numbers. So I feel like they have the chance to stop that doom loop with this and reset. And then, to your other point about growth, then you can start concentrating on things like growth. Now, there's a big contradiction here because you don't necessarily get growth from significant tax rises. But then I think, well, hang on, the tax rises aren't due to kick in until 2028. That is a long way away in economics and in politics. I feel like they would imagine that if they can do the things they want to do and up the growth rate, which is currently 1.5% assumed into the future, which, by the way, isn't awful. It's not a recession. It's not great. But kind of we'd have settled for that at the beginning of the year. If you can up that to 2, which you should be able to do if you've got command of Parliament, then you might not even need these tax rises in 3 or 4 years' time. Now, this is my theory. Yeah. It's probably wrong. But I just think we have to notice the timing and sequencing of the policies that were announced yesterday.
And in terms of things that are, I don't want to say buried in the budget, because they are there for you to see them. It just takes a little while to like process all the things that are going on. One of the things that seems to me is going to develop over the next few months and next few years is the funding for children with special educational needs and disabilities. So obviously a very emotive and important issue now. But Alex, what has Rachel Reeves decided that means it's going to come to the fore even more?
It's coming quickly down the track, and it's a really big challenge, not just for all the people that are going through that system, and every single parent who's got a child with special educational needs or disabilities will already know how much that system's under pressure. It's also a massive political and economic challenge that is hurtling towards this government, because in really simple terms, at the moment, councils fund services for children with SEND, special educational needs and disabilities.
Whether that's school places, whether that's
transport to get to home to school, or whatever extra provision that they might need. Now, the cost of that's been going up and up. More and more children have needed that kind of support, that extra provision. So councils have been really struggling, and the amount they're spending each year is increasing, and then also the amount of deficit, the amount that they're sort of sticking to one side unpaid for, is been piling up in the background. What the Chancellor said is that the Department for Education is going to take the costs of providing that support for children with SENDs into their department and off of councils.
So it's funded centrally rather than locally.
Exactly.
This is England, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
So the Office of Budget Responsibility has gone, OK, so this is going to go into the Department for Education. Right, well, that's going to be about £6 billion a year extra spending pressure. And then there's this question about what you deal with all the debt that's been building up in councils, which is about £14 billion the OBR predicts. That's what it's going to end up to. So what the OBR said is, look, if you don't put any extra funding into this, if you don't sort of do something with this system, at the moment, you've got no budget to take on that extra $6 billion. So that's going to have a real impact on the school's budget and actually see the school's budget per pupil go down. Now,
by about 5%, the OBR.
By 4.9%, the OBR. So really quite considerable. Now, what the government's saying is, hang on, look, we've got reforms to this system coming. They're coming down the line in the early part of next year. So it's not right to suggest this is going to hit the school's budget because we're going to find a way around this. But the big question behind that is, what do you do? Because the direction of travel is that ministers think there should be more provision in mainstream schools for children with special educational needs. But I've spoken to lots and lots of Labour MPs and others who are really familiar with the system, and they say if you're going to do that, that's going to require big extra resource for mainstream schools to make that happen. And then there's still this big question mark over what you do with these deficits which have been building up and which the OBR's calculation is going to be around £14 billion. That is not an insignificant amount of money, which there needs to be a decision on.
I think there's a bigger point here, which is that you set your spending, the spending review, you set a budget, you set what you think is the appropriate level of taxation, which is interesting. That's now 38% of GDP, highest it's been. We're basically at German levels now. Isn't that interesting? We haven't really debated that. We've moved away from sort of transatlantic style of tax to like continental level, European levels of taxation. But this is why, there's two things here. The demand has gone up for special educational needs, and in a huge way. The OBR have come in and decided, you know what, we need to take a look at this. The government, we hear, is not particularly happy with how they've approached it, but actually they're surfacing a real issue. And then you think about, in your wheelhouse, the politics of this, which is, does the government resist this demand that's going like that from parents that are just wanting to do the right thing for their kids, and this is an emergency for them? Or do they think this has gone too far and we need to somehow contain this increase in demand? And it's all well and good saying, well, it's definitely not going to come out of the education budget. Well, where's it going to come from then? This money is being spent. It's been hidden away in local authority borrowing numbers, so we haven't really noticed it. Essentially, I think in many ways, the OBR have done a very admirable job. They've surfaced the issue and now they're going to have to deal with it.
We're saying ever so briefly, already there are lots of Labour MPs who are saying, before you make any decisions around this, remember what happened with welfare when the government tried to make big changes to welfare and there was this huge political pushback because lots of Labour MPs had the perception the government was going a sort of cuts-first approach to welfare, and they're already very clearly saying, don't do this with SEND. And I think that's another massive challenge.
And added to that is that, when I spend my mornings swigging cups of tea in Portcullis House where lots of MPs and whatever and parliamentary staffers mingle, it doesn't matter what MP you're speaking to, from which part of the UK, of whatever political affiliation, and you start talking to them about their mailbag and what they're dealing with, and it's 2 or 3 minutes max, even if they start talking about the geopolitics of whatever before they're talking about SEND.
Because, like I said at the beginning, any parent who's got a child with special educational needs and disabilities knows just how much this system's under strain and have probably been, in many cases, through a real battle to get the support that their children need around this. So, it is a huge problem that doesn't seem to be a simple solution. The one thing I would say is that lots of MPs say the current ministerial team who are looking at this, and they're due to come up with reforms in the new year, that's been pushed back.
There's a delay, yeah.
There's a delay in that. They are saying they are really listening and they are sort of going out. In fact, they're doing this exercise where they're going around the country talking to parents, and they've had more than 100 sessions and they're trying to really get their heads around it. I just think there's no simple solution here.
Well, but then you do the parallel with welfare, right? You might approach this and say, we can only afford this amount of help as a nation for this issue. They could lean, it sounds like they don't want to, they could lean in some of the arguments we have with welfare, which is why, maybe this is not the best way to deal with it through the education budget. Maybe there's some other way to deal with it. It's but the extent to which a government wants to have tough conversations with welfare recipients, yes, they do. Here, maybe they don't, they run away. But then the consequence of that is, does this 6 billion black hole become a 9 billion, a 10 billion, 12 billion? Where's the money going to come from?
Or you begin to hear a public
matter?
argument about the trade-off between those two things, for instance. If you're going to have, as plenty of people in government say to me, they feel they absolutely have to have, which is another conversation both with the country and with their own MPs around welfare, is that, and I'm sort of guessing now about where a conversation might go, but is that framed around the pressure that is also mounting around send provision, and that you can only spend every pound.
And of course, none of this was in the election, just like the concept of maybe freezing income tax thresholds or raising more money on national insurance from things like pension contributions.
But they may also be not unrelated, what you're saying.
Sure.
You know, is there something I'd love to know, and people have, this is a hypothesis, I don't know, maybe Alex, you know more about this, that some of the send provision we're getting in schools is ending up on the welfare rolls with people are very young who we would think would be in the jobs market, going from send provision under 18, 20-somethings getting welfare on PIP maybe for mental health. I don't know, is there something happening?
There's quite often a cliff edge in the provision. So, if you do get SEND help, support and provision, there comes a point where that ends. And I think that's a very difficult transition for many individuals and families as well. So it is a broader conversation about what you do about it. The one thing I would say is that all of the conversations I've had with the people who are working on this, I think they are very attuned to the level of concern that's out there, not just in Westminster, but around the country, about the sensitivity and complexity of this issue, because what it of course involves is parents with children, and they just want the best for their children who just might need a bit of extra support, which adds to the challenge around it, I think.
And it's a different area, but a similar story. The OBR points out that the pledge to massively increase defence spending over the next decade, that hasn't really been budgeted for either yet. That's just a pledge with a number attached, but no actual money yet.
Well, I've always wondered, of course, the pledge is, you would imagine, would be after Donald Trump's presidency ends. So maybe they're just hoping that somebody else
it's one of those
turns
pledges.
Up in the White. Yeah.
Also, in terms of other pledges that the government did make at the election, the Employment Rights Bill was the centrepiece of that. That's sort of giving workers a lot more rights on day one in their job. And there's been a bit of toing and froing this week between the government, the House of Lords, trade unions, employers, and that toing and froing sort of ended on Thursday tea time.
Yeah, with another U-turn, I think it's fair to say, because
which the government would call a compromise.
The government is calling it a compromise, and to be fair, they have been thrashing this out between some big business groups, between the unions and between ministers over the course of this week, really quite intensely. And the compromise stroke U-turn, choose whatever you wish, is that now from day one, which had been the intention, you're not going to be protected from unfair dismissal. That's now going to kick in after 6 months. Now, what the government is saying, you are still getting other rights from day one that they promised, things like sick pay and parental leave. So this is still a much better package. But that unfair dismissal right, which they had said was going to come in from day one in their manifesto, that's now going to come in after 6 months. And what they are saying is that this is a compromise. And the truth of it is that the response from many of the unions who've been involved in these negotiations and the business groups, and Faisal will know more about that side of it than I do, but they seem to have broadly welcomed this as a quite sensible compromise. Nonetheless, it isn't what the government said it was going to deliver. And this was another really key flagship piece of legislation that they promised.
I also just wonder, Faisal, is this business getting one thing they wanted, which is a delay to the employment rights thing, while also having to suck up a big increase in the national living wage and the national minimum wage, which lots of employers say we're happy to pay, but it does mean we'll have to pay fewer staff.
Obviously, those business groups and those businesses, especially in hospitality and retail, felt under a huge amount of pressure from the combination of the national living wage and the extra employers' rights. They say this has been factored into the cost of labour. They've had to pass on some of this stuff in terms of prices. Generally speaking, it hasn't helped. It hasn't helped with job creation. It maybe hasn't helped in terms of the inflationary situation in the UK. But I think it was always the case that the business secretary, who was now Peter Kyle, that they were going to have some optionality to consult over exactly how these new rights were enacted.
And there's so many bits of this massive piece of legislation that will happen next year, the year after next, the year after that, after a consultation, after whoever is the business minister in 2 years' time lays a regulation.
And they wanted to crack on. They were conscious that as they felt it, this was getting bogged down. And why not try and... They felt that there was a path to what, they will argue is a compromise, even though it does involve a rowing back from where they were, so that they can crack on with it.
So it's rowing back from where Angela Rayner may have been. Mm-hmm. I imagine that sort of Peter Kyle, with his slightly different politics, would be quite happy with this sort of compromise.
I think so. And then making that wider argument that if you want to get on with all of the other stuff that they would regard as a positive, then let's make sure we're not getting slowed down by stuff that others are not keen on. And they've, encountered a few bumps in the House of Lords. and would rather think, OK, let's find a way of getting on with this.
Because the House of Lords have this week been voting on this and we're effectively voting in this notion that you could only be protected from unfair dismissal after 6 months. So that's another sort of political factor on calculation. But Peter Carr's actually been talking about this on Thursday night and was making that point. He was saying this is a considered compromise, and is it not better that we reach a compromise that actually both the unions and the business groups involved in these negotiations are happy with, rather than be frustrated in this process of getting this package of improved employment rights as they would see it through.
Sometimes we do forget this is still a government with a massive majority, and when they clear out the barnacles of the constant hamster wheel of fiscal speculation and whether or not the leadership speculation, they still have the power to do what they want to do, and they have an immense amount of power to do so.
The levers of government allowing them to do stuff. I've been speaking to people. It's on this point of the hamster wheel where you hear frustration from government ministers in recent months of, we've got a massive majority. We're in government. We have levers of power. We can do stuff. And yet somehow, because of all of the endless stuff about...
Well, the thing they've done is increase taxes by £26 billion by the end of this month.
In 3 years' time.
This week.
Is that idea of cracking on and doing stuff and then having and picking fights, having arguments, but using those levers of government, because that's what being in government allows you to do.
I do think people might underestimate the sort of subtle consequences of what we saw at the budget yesterday in terms of sort of clearing the way to get some stuff done. One might say finally, right? I still, we can still argue about whether the stuff they want to get done is going to work, whether it's going to actually cause growth, whether it's good for certain people, bad for certain people. But what we've had over the past year, I mean, it was just not what we probably expected, really. Right. Just put it like that subtly.
And also, Chris, another example of where the conversation could actually change quite quickly, in theory, is around migration. Because today, the Office for National Statistics put out the latest net migration figures. So the number of people arriving in the UK subtracted by the number of people who left. And it's fallen by 2/3 in a year. So obviously this is legal, organised migration, people coming over on visas or to be reunited with their family who are here already. This is not small boats or irregular, and it's not asylum processing. But that's a big change, and will make that conversation potentially feel very different.
Really big change. When you put it in the context of recent statistical moments around all of this that has made huge headlines when the numbers were going up and up and up, and how prominent and salient that whole question has been and remains in our politics, how keen ministers are to see that number going down. It's not that much of a surprise that there's been a significant fall. There was an expectation that was the direction of travel of where the numbers were going. But, when I speak to folk in government, they will so often come back to, and these are massive challenges, but if they can be seen to be, if their bank of credibility can be seen to be being stocked up over time on the two issues, the economy and then migration, legal and illegal, then they think they could be still in with a fighting chance, even though at the moment the opinion polls have them in a dire place. And they will hope a combination of what they did yesterday with the budget and how that washes through, and then these numbers on migration are, if you like, straws in the wind that from their perspective are pointing in the right direction.
It's just worth saying on the migration figures, you're right, the net migration figures have had that huge drop. But we also had a separate set of figures today from the government looking at asylum claims. And actually, the asylum claims in the year to September have edged up. And so too have the number of people currently living in hotels.
Yeah.
Although so has the number of decisions about asylum that the government's making. So it's sort of processing through them quicker. But it's just worth noting that in the broader context, because from the government's perspective, that too is clearly a challenge.
The great irony, of course, is if they do get the economy whirring a little bit more than has been
for migration.
No. I mean the number. I'm saying this now.
To fuel the economy.
I'm making a prediction. That we'll have totally the opposite conversation.
Well,
in 2 or 3 months.
As I discovered
6 months.
last week's episode of Newscast on Thursday night, after being a journalist for more than 20 years, hang on, the migration system is a work in progress forever, because the world keeps changing, and we sort of think, we're going to crack it one day and get the perfect number, and there isn't a perfect number because it's a combination of lots of things. Alex, thank you.
Pleasure as ever.
Faisal, thanks to you too.
Great to be here.
And Chris, good to catch up.
Cheers.
And that's all for this episode of Newscast. Thank you very much for watching. Bye-bye.
Newscast from the BBC.